Dear students, myself Dr. Fatima Sultana, Associate Professor in Department of Zoology, JDB Government Girls College, Kota. Today I am going to discuss about the forest rights. What is forest rights? Forest landscapes cover over 23% of the country. हमारे देश का 23% जो है फॉरेस्ट लैंडस्केप्स है। और होता क्या है कि around 200 million, that is 20% of the population, live in and near India's forest land. जंगल के आसपास या उसके अंदर रहने वाले कम से कम 200 मिलियन पॉपुलेशन है ह्यूमन बींग. बट व्हाट हैपेंस? They had no legal right to their homes, lands, or livelihoods. So, what was the result? The result was that both forest and people were suffering. Therefore, in 2016, scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers, also recognized as Forest Rights Act, was passed, which granted legal recognition to the rights of traditional forest dwelling communities. So, recognition of Forest Right Act 2006 schedule and other traditional forest dwellers, that the forest legislation passed in India at December 18, 2006. This is the call which is known as the Forest Right Act. Indian Forest Act and Tribal Act was implemented in 1927. It was enacted on 21st September 1927. Many amendments have been done after that. The Indian Forest Act was enacted to preserve and safeguard the forest in India. The act makes various provisions for such conservations of forest, and in the scheme it provides for a state government to constitute any forest land or wastelands which are property of government, over which the government have proprietary rights, a reserved forest. To consolidate the law relating to forest, the transit of forest produce, and the duty leviable on timber and other forest produce. It has 13 chapters and includes a total of 85 sections altogether. The basic purpose of legislation has been to protect the forest from misuse and damage done by either man or animal. Forest policy's objectives were: it lays down procedures for constituting and managing different kinds of forest, like reserved and protected forest. It provides rules to restrict people's action in and around public and community forests. It prescribes duties of the public and the public servants in relation to forest, and chalks out penalties for violating rules. Indian Forest Act 1927 is the single largest and most important piece of legislation on forest. This act has only minor differences between with the 1878 Forest Act, with the philosophy remaining the same. That is, in 1878, that is long before 1927 Act, there was the Forest Act. So there are minor differences between that which was implemented in 1878, that is during the British time, and later on in 1927. And after 1927 also there were many amendments. The different types of forest. They are categorized as reserve forest, village forest, protected forest, non-government. Reserved forest is declared by state. It has government rights. Village forest, reserved forest rights to the villagers. Protected forest, the non-reserved, owned by government. The most well-stocked forests were declared as reserved forest. It is the strictest tenure class in which Locals have no rights. The right of passage, water, and grazing are allowed as concessions with government approval. Demarcation of forest. The first step in the establishment of states' control over forest was a demarcation between reserved and wasteland forest. Forest officer. Above this all, a forest officer or settlement officer is appointed to look after these reserved forests. The person is responsible to protect rather police, and these powers are vested in him under the Forest Act of 1927. Ordinarily be a person not holding any forest office except that of forest settlement officer. Now this Forest Rights Act, which was implemented on 18th December 2006, the scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers act, it is also known as Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act 2006, a key piece of forest legislation passed in India on December 18. It is also called as Forest Rights Act, Tribal Rights Act, Tribal Bill, Tribal Land Act. It deals with the rights of forest dwelling communities over land and other resources denied to them for decades. Now these tribal peoples, they had to fight for their rights. Their motto was that our forest, our rights. So according to this right, which was implemented in 2006, the rights of the forest dwelling communities over the land and other resources which was denied to them for decades were given. Now amendment of Indian Forest Act 1865. The Indian Forest Act, amended twice in the years 1878 and 1927. The 1878 Act divided forest into three categories: reserved forest, protected forest, village forest. The best forests were called reserved forest. The villagers could not take anything from the forest even for their own use. For house building or fuel, they could take wood from protected or village forest. So, according to the Indian Forest Act 1878, the best forests were called reserved forest. Villagers were not allowed to take anything from these forests, and these were the reserved forest. And in the category of protected forest, villagers were allowed to take wood for house building or fuel. In village forest category, villagers were allowed to take wood for house building or fuel. So we can see that there was in the total ban was there on reserved forest for hunting, grazing, or even taking the wood for fuel. But with the permission of government concessions, the villagers could take wood for house building or fuel from protected forest and village forest. Now, the classification of forest. Reserved forests are the forests that are regarded as the most valuable as far as the conservation of forest and wildlife resources are concerned. More than half of the total forest land has been declared reserved forest. Protected forest. This forest land is protected from any further depletion. Almost one third of the total forest area is protected forest, as declared by the Forest Department. Of the total forest covers, 29.2% are the protected forest. Unclassified forest, these are the other forests of wasteland that belong to both government and private individual and communities. Here, no restrictions are imposed, but because of the inaccessibility and hostile terrain, nobody can easily make use of them. Of the total forest cover, 16% are unclassed forest. The other environment acts of India are the Wildlife Protection Act, in which National Tiger Conservation Authority, National Board for Wildlife, Central Zoo Authority, Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. Environment Protection Act 1986, which looks after the environment impact assessment, genetic engineering, appraisal committee, coastal regulation zone, ecological sensitive areas. Biological Diversity Act 2002, National Biodiversity Authority, state biodiversity boards, biological management committees, and biological heritage sites. Now, because of these various policies and acts, the forest could be conserved, but there are still many problems where human being and forest dwellers and the forest which are a treasure for us, they are all still complicated. The awareness is very essential to understand the demarcation between the conservation and the sustainability. I will give the PDF notes of the 13 chapters of this 2006 Act and 1927 Act. So you can go through this. Thank you so much.